All right. So we just went through installing Unity, getting used to just building the project, getting used to version control. This is Unity that's open, and this is my prototype for my Sprint 1. I'll go through how I got to this point, but I just wanted to have something open as we look at Unity. Notice that we have different panels of Unity. And so over here we have the hierarchy. This is the scene view. This is the game view. The inspector. Over here, down here, the project view. Notice there can be multiple tabs, and so you can move through them. All this stuff you can move, you can delete, you can bring it back. And yours might look different than mine. Yours might even look like this, where scene and game are right on top of each other. I normally don't like that because I like to pull game off, pop them over there, and the scene view is for you, the developer, to move around and look at your world that you're building, and the game view is to see what the user's going to see. So normally I like to look at them at the same time. So this is my default setup, and this is when I teach the rest of the class. The Unity will look like this. The left-hand side is the hierarchy. This is a list view of all the objects that are currently in this scene. You can think of a scene as a section of an app, as a level of a game. So when you use an app, you might move between different parts of an app through the user interface to do different things. As a game, there might be like a start scene, an intro, a tutorial, and different levels, and maybe a map to choose between different levels. All those are different scenes. They're different parts, they're different levels, and we're in one scene right now. This happens to be the intro scene that I built out with all the research data. So I'm looking here into the world, and I'm building stuff, and I'm looking at what it looks like to the user, and I click play once stuff is in some type of state to see what it feels like in an interactive mode, to see how it'll be represented to the player, to the user for testing. And then you click out of play. So I will say that if you're super new to Unity, you're going to have to come to the lab times. I'm going to have to get, I'm going to assign you some tutorials from my IT 201 class. So the prereqs of IT 380 is IT 201, but some students may have gotten special permissions. Some students may have taken IT 201 from a different teacher or from a long time ago. So my IT 201 is based off this building this 3D paint tool. It's right here on my website. You can go to Part 1, 3D Dev. This explains how we're going to go through the different stages of this class. And you can go to Sprint 1, 2, and 3, 4. And this explains what we're learning for those series of weeks. So usually a sprint lasts about a month in the classroom. It's a good length of time. And so you see that there's different learning weeks. There's the build, the code, the lectures, and if you scroll down, all the lecture videos, and it explains Unity from scratch and user interface and everything else that you need to know. So I will be talking about stuff like this, and I will be starting from basics, but I will kind of glaze over stuff. So as you're going through the week, if something is new to you, either come into lab time and let's talk to me. Let's find some videos from 201 or the sections. And in 201, if you take it with me, we end up building or making more features in an iterative build fashion for this type of paints program. So you have an interface. The interface can change different ways that objects get painted. All right, and so a lot of this, we're going to be reusing a lot of ideas or a lot of new knowledge from this class. So anyway, it's all here on my website. under this part 1, here's sprint 1, 2, 3, 4. So anyway, as I'm moving through Unity knowledge, just come to lab time as needed, or send, if it's later in a week, send me an email and talk to me. All right. But Unity is broken down into these major parts, and if you make a complete mess of it or whatever, you can always go to layouts and reset it. So the first thing that you're going to see is you have assets, scenes, and you'll have an empty scene. So if I just create a scene, I'll just call it empty. Jump into it, it'll look like this. You have to have a camera because your player, your game view needs to see something. There needs to be a camera, and there needs to be some type of light source. This is a directional light. It's like supposed to mimic the sun, and this is what gives it this whole like procedural sky system. So you have this feel of a ground and a sky, just to at least start with something. And that's what's coming from this light source. And that's what an empty scene is. Here are the objects. Here's looking at scene view. Here's what the user sees. To move around, press the F key to zoom up on stuff. You can hold down Alt and left click to tumble or rotate around the object you have selected. Alt and middle click to pan. Pan the camera means it move up and down, left and right. So one thing to note is that this is the main camera. Usually there's supposed to be a full string. There it is. I was wondering why everything was not showing up. Here's the light source. This is what the little gizmo looks like in the scene view. What I wanted to note is that this is the camera that the player sees, main camera. I am moving around the camera, but it's not named, it's not showing you, it's the scene view. It's for the developer to move around at wherever they want and not mess around with the main camera. But this full stream that's coming out shows you what the main camera sees in its field of view. Notice as I'm moving, there's a gizmo up here. We have X, Y, and Z. We're in 3 dimensions. So X and Y is just like a graph paper that you use in math classes, showing a 2-dimensional graph of some equation. And now we have the Z, the forward backward, to enter the 3rd dimension. And we're in perspective view. And you can use this little gizmo up here and click on different angles to see it in what's called orthographic views, or write down one type of axis. So we do have perspective view, and you click again, we have isometric. We get rid of the perspective distortion, which is sometimes useful for 2D. But just know that this is the 3D world we're working in. Here's a bunch of the objects. Here's the scene that we're in. It's called empty. Over here is the game view. Down here is project. Notice I have some more folders than you. You probably just have assets and scenes. As I start creating stuff like C# scripts, I'll create a folder for scripts. As I start bringing in images or JPEGs from the internet, I'll have a folder called images. I started to build out a prefab. We don't have to talk about that right now. But notice, and then scenes. Here's the actual scenes, or the levels, or the parts of my app. Notice that it's nicely organized under assets. If I right click on assets, say show and explore, this is that assets folder in the project. It's just, this is the view of it in Unity. We have packages for external assets, more content provided by Unity or some third-party package. The one I did bring in was Text Mesh Pro. So the one thing with Unity's default text, we're going to use a lot of user interfaces. Default text is it's blurry, jaggy, it's low res, doesn't look the best. So if you go to Window, and notice how Text Mesh Pro is already installed, but if you go to Package Manager, and it'll look like this, a whole bunch of packages that are available for free from Unity that give additional features, functionality, content, whatever. You can go down to Text Mesh Pro, And here it'll say like download, update, install. So just keep clicking it until it gets imported. I think first you have to download it, then you have to import it, whatever. But in this case, make sure it's in your project to the point where you keep installing it and you'll see a folder here. And then this we're going to use eventually with our user interface. Oops, go on a camera. And we're going to have, instead of text objects or button objects or drop downs, we're going to use the Text Mesh Pro. Now notice some of these elements of the user interface have the Text Mesh Pro equivalent and some don't. That's because some don't have text. A slider is just a graphic. Toggle is just a graphic. But a button will normally have a name on it, a title, a label, and a text element is text. Right, so image doesn't usually have a text with it, so that's why some of these are Text Mesh Pro and some are not. So I guess if we're up here, we have the general file commands, edit, like copy, paste, undo. We can create assets, which are within Unity, so C# scripts, folders, shaders, scenes, materials, which will cover some of this stuff, and then game objects are objects which you think of as object-oriented programming. It's an object that lives in this part of the app, in this scene, and it can have a visual, a renderable part to it, and it doesn't have to. And an object in Unity will have objects underneath it, so they use what's called an entity component system to give features to objects. In this case, this directional light object. If we look over in the inspector, it's the details of this object. This turns it on and off. This, when we turn the light source off, it greatly changes our lighting. But this is the object, and there's just like higher level or metadata on it, name, should you turn it on and off, the other stuff we'll get into. These underneath here are its components, and each component is actually an object as well. So we're going to be working as writing C# code. We're going to be writing classes, which are like blueprints of objects, and the objects get instantiated at runtime. In any case, this is what's called a game object, or it's an object that lives in our scene, and it has a series of other objects which are not game objects that do other things, give other features, and live on the main game object as component objects. So this one is a transform. This allows it to give it a position, a rotation, and a scaling. This allows it to live in the 3D world. Notice as I'm moving this object, the position numbers are changing in the top right. And you can rotate. That was the E key to move to the rotate tool. And notice as I rotate this object, yes, the numbers or rotation numbers are changing, but this light source actually changes how the lighting appears in our virtual world. So that's rotation. We can go back W, back to move, Q just to select, W to move, E to rotate, and then R to scale. And the scaling numbers change, but a light source doesn't really scale. That doesn't really make sense. But if I bring in just like a cube, something that is a piece of geometry, something that does make sense when you scale it, this is what it looks like when something scales, small to big, and the scale numbers change, and you can rotate it, and you can move its position. So all these are because there's a transform object that lives as a component. So if I go back to the light source, there's only one other, press the F key, there's only one other object living as a component that gives a separate set of features. In this case, it's a light source, and there's many different things you can change. These are all properties or parameters, variables, attributes. You change them, and it changes characteristics of this object. Directional light, spotlight, point light, different levels of intensity, brightness, color, what have you. And this is why there's a light source. It has a light component on it. The camera has the transform as well, has the name and the game object stuff, but as a camera component, a camera object that lives as a component underneath the main camera game object. And there's also an audio listener. This is so that there's audio can play through the speakers and you can hear something. There's a audio component, a listener on the camera because this is where the player is. And since we're on a cube, it has a transform, but it also has some stuff that deal with geometry. The mesh filter, the mesh renderer, you can actually see it. There's a collider on it, which we'll get into physics later, and some type of material property on it. So just note that there's more components on this. Yeah, I think, so we installed TextMesh Pro. We went over some objects. I think I'm going to take a pause. That was 15 minutes. That was a good intro to Unity.